Hello, I'm Rafael Gomez, your host of Speaking Freely, Canada's newest forum for open discussion and debate. Our program is about Canada's past, present, and future. We want to tackle stories that many Canadians have either forgotten about or that the media has failed to look into. We will be bringing on guests that are intelligent and with something to say. People whose views are not taken from scripted talking points or political party platforms. We want honest opinions and informed debate. Our first episode will examine the state of Canada's media and journalism in a show we are titling, Has the Media Become the Message? A play on Marshall McLuhan's famous adage that the medium is the message. It was Marshall McLuhan who understood quite presciently that the way in which people consume information can affect the kind of information that they actually receive and how they interpret it. At the time, moving from long-form, broadsheet print to TV, in McLuhan's thinking, would necessitate a change in form, from complicated ideas to simple ideas, from lengthy investigations to quick quotes and sound bites. Does that sound familiar? Well, the move towards clickbait journalism has clearly been affected by the internet and social media, today's version of TV. But paradoxically, as we will see on today's episode, the internet has also ushered in an explosion in independent media. Platforms like Substack and Medium have given voice to accomplished journalists and media personalities that have decided to leave the conventional mainstream news and start their own reporting on their own information hubs. And guess what? They've attracted thousands of followers and paid subscribers. In the US, names like Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald, to name but a few, have millions of readers and followers of their independent programming. Contrast that with the declining nightly viewership on mainstream channels, and we've arrived at an interesting juncture in contemporary history. What has driven well-established journalists and media personalities to go it alone? What makes the independent journalist such a scary proposition to certain political leaders at the moment? And here's where it gets really interesting. It's in Western democracies like Canada at the moment, and amongst ostensibly liberal and progressive voices, that the calls to censor and control the messages coming from this new independent medium of Substack reporting has grown loudest. Why? And we have not even mentioned the explosion of long, independent form podcasts and interview shows like the Joe Rogan Experience. Say what you want about Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan, love them, hate them, or find them indifferent. The success of those podcasts defies conventional mainstream thinking. 3-hour interviews with one guest, a decided lack of slick production values, and certainly much more free-form discussion than any conventional production would allow. So here's a possibility. Maybe the mainstream media is underestimating the public tolerance for nuance and deeply researched information. Maybe the success of these long-form independent media voices is a hopeful sign that the time is ripe for a new way in which citizens interact with their information. Something curated by themselves in which they can access when they choose. Put another way, are people just starved for what they perceive as authentic content? Is there in fact a missing middle that current mainstream media is missing? Might there be a generational difference at play? Countries like Canada have never been as generationally diverse. By this I mean, we used to have a pretty simple population pyramid. Lots of young people at the bottom, a middle group at work, and then a smaller cohort of people who are retired and out of work. But now that pyramid has literally gone pear-shaped. Because of the size of the baby boom generation, never before have this many people in their 60s and 70s remained an active part of the workforce and have remained active in society more generally. Is this the reason for the splintering in media messaging? A legacy media of newspapers, radio, and TV increasingly catering to an older boomer generation? And maybe, just maybe, what we are witnessing is a generational shift towards independent reporting and information gathering that's driven by a younger generation. Again, thinking back to Marshall McLuhan, maybe Canadians are more willing to trust their own instincts in matters that they feel are important to them. They are digital natives. They feel comfortable searching for information on the internet and not worrying about where they get that information. relying on mainstream media's so-called gatekeepers is maybe a quaint notion, kind of like the time before Gutenberg invented the printing press. And what did we need before that? We needed priests and the church to tell us what the Bible was telling us. But it was less than 20 years after the invention of the printing press that the structures of old Catholic Europe began to give way towards a more individualized and decentralized Protestant religious order, a place where information was more democratically given and personalized. It's been just over 20 years since the internet reached the mass of people, when Google first appeared, and just over a decade and a half since the arrival of social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. So in historical terms, this is actually not that long a time for these trends to be playing out right now. Well, today we will be hearing from Canadians, ordinary people on the street, and 3 media voices, new, independent journalists that have dared to leave the security of their legacy media jobs and go it alone and forge a more independent path. Joining us today will be Tara Henley, former CBC journalist, producer, and author of the best-selling book, Lean Out. Jamil, Jivani, former radio broadcaster, lawyer, advisor to governments, and also best-selling author of Why Young Men. And finally, Gerson, journalist and co-founder, along with Matt Gurney, of The Line, one of Canada's newest but most popular national news outlets. So stay tuned and join us after the break, when we will go out on the streets of Toronto to ask ordinary citizens about how and where they consume their news, and whether they still have faith in mainstream media. Welcome back to Speaking Freely with your host, Rafael Gomez. So on today's show, we're going to be speaking to 3 independent journalists. Tara Henley, who most recently worked for the CBC as a well-regarded journalist and reporter. Jamil Jivani, who until recently had a national radio program. And finally, from Gerson, who just a few years ago started her own newspaper online, co-founded with Matt Gurney from the National Post, and is widely popular. So actually, before we interview our 3 guests, we're going to actually see and hear from Canadians like you, who were asked the question, where do you get your information, and what do you rely on and trust? Do you watch the daily news? And if so, do you watch them like every night or once a week or once a month? Or?
To be honest, I never watch the news.
Sometimes, but mostly it's my parents watching, like when they have it on in the background, I'll watch a little bit, but not usually.
Yeah, my main source would be local news,
Okay.
definitely. I don't really use online, maybe because of my age group. I don't feel comfortable. And also, like I read 2 papers in the morning, so I always get the Globe and the Star in the morning because they have 2 different perspectives. So that's where I would get it.
No, not really, no.
So if you don't watch the news, where do you get like your information about current events and so on?
Okay, like usually I will say on the mornings when I'm at work, I usually check on Google News, the most of the information, and the other was like through gossip. You know, people always tells you like, do you know what's going on in Ukraine? You know what's going on?
Twitter.
Twitter?
Yeah, I usually read lots of tweets. I usually follow like the social medias about for example, like Event 24, like CBC.
Right.
I follow those medias.
I see.
Yeah, I just read it, but I don't watch it.
Well, I think I grew up in an era where we were only exposed to paper print, so we probably gravitated towards reputable writers, like in the Globe and Mail. Like I'm in the medical field, so we would steer away from the Toronto Sun, for example, or the Toronto Star. But I think you align yourself with the writers that you are, I guess you trust, and then you would read those publications. Nowadays, with the internet, quite frankly, we don't even subscribe to paper print anymore, and we just target those writers and we look them up on the internet and go to those sources directly.
And do you find that the sources of information that you get from the mainstream nightly news, do you trust them generally?
Half-half. I find sometimes feel like the media is kind of clouded based off of what they want to show.
Do you feel reliable when you go through the internet and look at stories?
It's more I look for the information that I care about, you know, because the other thing has too much things. So, and then I look for the source, and usually I will say that I go more for the American things, for CNN or like New York Times or all those things. So I kind of think that I trust them. But who knows now if things are real or not? Because someone controls what they want the other people to know. So.
Sure. How much faith or trust do you have in journalists in presenting to you with the information that you see or read or hear?
Oh, okay. I think I trust. Like when I read, to be honest, I usually trust. But I have like few friends who I believe their perspective, or I usually ask them, what do you think about this? I read this, but I don't have too much information about it. What do you think? Then I ask them.
That's good.
Probably this is what I do most of the time.
Excellent. So you have friends that you can also discuss things with.
Exactly. This is most of the time what I'm doing.
You said something interesting. I don't know if you meant to be this precise. You said you watch the local news.
Local news, yes.
Local news. Does that mean you're less interested in the national broadcast?
No, I do.
Okay.
No, well, generally, you know, I like to watch the 6 o'clock news. A lot of it's local. Right?
Yeah, of course.
I like to know what's happening in my own backyard.
Of course.
Nationally, of course, I'll watch 11 o'clock, and I'll get the national news.
Mm-hmm.
I do watch a little bit of CNN.
Sure.
And I'm just finding it just getting a little
Yeah.
It's like a reel. It's the same repeat.
The same thing
repeat.
over and over.
But I'm starting watching CNBC. It gives you an hour of a snapshot of what's happening. Not,
Okay.
Whether there's Ukrainian
Sure.
or whatever the stock market.
Yeah.
It's just an overview in an hour.
Yeah,
That's
and
what
that
I like to watch.
encapsulates. Do you think it'll continue, this trend to searching out your own information? Or do you think we'll go back to watching, the news at night? Yeah.
No. No, I think that for us, it's like, the generations of now, like, we don't have time for, like, see and watch. Even, people is busy with Netflix and other things. So, like, probably people get the information that they want in their iPhones. Like, with your phone, you kind of filter what you want to see, and then you just give a quick look, and then you kind of know what's going on. But I don't think that we're going to go back to TV.
Would you say over the last 2 years, your impression of the news media has improved, stayed the same, gotten worse?
Morning news in certain stations, I just find I can't tune into it.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of gibberish going on. So my source would be newspapers, just because of that.
Yeah.
But generally, if I'll watch more evening news or a late news.
Okay.
That's what I do.
Yeah.
But the morning news, I just find I don't know, something's lost.
And I would say for mainstream media, probably decreased.
Okay. And how have you compensated for that? If you kind of have a bit of a decreased, sense of trust in those mainstream sources, how do you compensate for that?
I think if you're somewhat educated and you do your due diligence, you find out the people who you trust and you just search for them rather than let the news come to you. You search for the news.
Oh, that's a good point.
So that's how I do it, or we do it.
Yeah. Are you interested in news and daily events?
Sometimes, I think it's like when it's big stuff happening a lot that you see a lot on social media, social media really affects kind of what I watch.
I see. So social media is where you primarily get your information nowadays? And is there a trusted source within, because social media can be very big, are there persons or sources that you trust more than others?
Not really. It's usually if my parents are watching, I use it from that, or just social media and other influencers and stuff like that, talking about.
Okay. Do you find that there's people that you trust, in your own personal life, that you can talk about, the daily events and the news, and that you kind of, ask their opinions, or do you have that?
Yes, for sure.
That's
for
good.
Sure. Yeah. Now, we may not always agree. There are certain things, where nobody's really right or wrong.
No, that's good to know.
Really?
Yeah.
It's should be vaccinated or not vaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
You can argue till the cows come home. Who's right, who's wrong.
Yeah.
But I think the key here is to appreciate each other's opinions.
Oh, that's great to hear.
Right? So,
yeah, absolutely.
So I may not agree with you, but at least agree, my position, appreciate my position, and vice versa.
I will say that I listen people, I listen friends that tells me news. I don't know how reliable is that, but usually people tells you every kind of thing. So then you do your own research about what you care, and then you check if it's true or not.
What would be an improvement that people could make, say in their own lives, in terms of getting information? What's one thing that you would say is a good piece of advice?
Maybe not just not trust everything you hear right away. I think you should verify it yourself first.
Right.
I feel like a lot of times people's opinions are biased.
Yeah.
And that kind of sways the media one way or another. And I feel like if you have an opinion about something, you should probably try to fact check it yourself and see if other places are kind of saying the same thing or different things, kind of make your own decision on it.
Welcome back to Speaking Freely with your host, Rafael Gomez. Today's show is about the media. And today we have 3 independent media journalists that have been giving Canadians unfiltered information. Tara Henley, Jamil Jivani, and Jen Gerson. I want to start with you, Tara. You had a job on the CBC. You'd worked on many different medium platforms, TV, the news, radio broadcast. What happened? Why did you feel you had to leave the CBC in order to stake out on your own and tell your own stories?
So I have been a journalist for 20 years, and in that time I've worked in TV, in radio, in magazines, in newspapers, and online. And basically the first part of my career, I worked in hip hop. For the first 6 years of my career, I was a music journalist. And then I went to women's magazines from there. And then the last 8 or 9 years, I've been in current affairs. So taking the news of the day and putting that into context and trying to understand kind of what's happening in our society in a big picture way. I was at CBC for a number of years in the producer pool. I worked for a lot of different radio shows, as well as a season on George Stroumboulopoulos Tonight. And recently, a couple of years ago, I also wrote a book called Lean Out, which is a current affairs book about sort of the craziness of, the modern world and work and burnout. And I, throughout the pandemic was back in the producer pool working in current affairs radio, and have really noticed a change in sort of the timbre of what it is like to be a journalist in legacy media. And I felt that I could no longer ask the kind of questions that I wanted to ask. I felt like there were some basic functions of journalism that I wasn't able to perform anymore, and that the newsroom had become pretty highly politicized. And as throughout the pandemic, we've seen all across society, I felt like it was really time for me to go out on my own to be able to do the work that I most wanted to do. So now I'm at Substack. I do a weekly podcast, but I also do a bunch of interviews every week and really try to get at these topics that are difficult to talk about, and that a lot of questions on those topics are not being asked in the legacy media. And so that's what I'm working to do now at Substack.
Excellent, thanks. That was a great description. And your journey from magazines, TV, radio, you actually captured the gamut of legacy media. I wanted to switch now to Jamil. Jamil, you most recently had a radio show, and I was invited on, so full disclosure. I was on your show a couple times. I was wondering, Jamil, if you could tell the audience that journey. And of course, you were a lawyer, have been practicing law in the past. You're an author. You're also advisor to government. I wondered if you could just tell us a bit of that journey and the most recent transition from radio to also having a Substack journalistic outlet.
Thanks, Rafael. I come into media work recognizing that I have seen some of the best parts of our country and some of the most challenging parts of our country. I grew up in a community where we weren't given a lot of opportunity. I was considered illiterate when I was in high school. And by the grace of God and support from mentors in my community, I was able to get to law school, become a lawyer, write a book about what I've learned from my life and some of my peers and other young men who struggle in our economy and struggle in our society. So I've been able to see a lot of life. And one of the exciting things about media work, if you've lived in places where people don't often get a voice in the media, is that you get a chance to bring those voices with you to the forefront. So when I started my radio show a couple of years ago with Bell Media and the iHeartRadio Talk Network, that's what I was excited about. But unfortunately, a lot of media, including Bell, is going through what I would call a diversity panic, where in an attempt to appear diverse, they are looking for people who look differently, but ultimately are trying to say the exact same things that these multinational corporations and these big tech companies are comfortable with. And so in the process of being hired to bring a diverse perspective to the radio, my employer, Bell Media, realized that they were not going to be able to control me, and I was not going to say the things that they wanted people to say. And ultimately, I think that it came down to a different view of what diversity means. And this is, I think, one of the most important conversations happening in media right now. By diversity, do we mean people who purely look differently? Or do we mean people who might think differently, bring different experiences and perspectives to the media? I believe that the latter is important. I believe we need diversity of thought and opinion and lived experience. Unfortunately, a lot of these big media companies don't share that view.
Absolutely. That's an interesting take on diversity and what we really mean by it. A superficial diversity or something a little deeper of more quality. Jen, I want to turn to you, last but not least, of course, co-editor, co-founder of The Line, great title, by the way, which is an online newspaper, if you want to call it. Jen, why don't you tell us your story? You were an accomplished writer, journalist before starting The Line. What made you venture out on your own?
Sure. So, I mean, I had a very conventional path into journalism, what a lot of people would call pedigreed path into journalism. I came from suburban British Columbia, raised by single mom and the whole works. And I just decided at 16, I'm going to be a journalist. Nobody told me I couldn't do that. So I went to Ryerson University because I was told that was the best school for journalism. Graduated there, got internships at the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star, worked in the Middle East for a few years, came back and worked at the Calgary Herald for a few years after that, and then got a job at the National Post. So, I mean, I was one of the very lucky few journalists who had, a steady progression of staff journalism jobs in newspapers. And I think, what was it, 2-3 years ago now? I kind of forget what happened, but I mean, I basically just sort of rage quit the National Post due to a whole bunch of internal issues that really have nothing to do with any of this, and decided to go freelance. Had a great time going freelance, did very well as a freelancer, had my second baby, and just as I was coming back off of mat leave with my second baby, COVID hits, and I found that I had a much harder time after my second baby getting the freelance stuff going again. Of course, the pandemic changed a lot of things for a lot of people. A lot of the freelance budgets got cut at almost all the places I was working. And also in the middle of 2020, there were the killing of George Floyd. There was a massive sort of institutional questions around race, diversity, social justice, and those sorts of issues, which was fine, except that it suddenly became clear to me that certain perspectives just weren't going to be as welcomed as they had been previously, even 6 months prior to that. And at that point, I just realized that a combination of the institutional factors, the social factors, and the financial factors was going to mean that it was going to be a much better bet for me if we just went independent. And so Matt Gurney and I, who's the other co-founder of The Line, and he was working at the Post at the time, we were just like, we just need to start our own thing. We just need to do it. There was no planning. There was no business plan. It was just like, we're just going to start a thing and we're going to put it out there. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't work, we'll quit and we'll do something else. I had nothing to lose at that point.
Nothing to lose. I think that's a great way to sum up what we heard today, at least in this first segment. We're going to come back to all three of you, and we're going to start a more free-form discussion about media, about the legacy media, and the role of independent outlets and journalists like yourselves. So when we come back, we're going to hear from all three of you once again. Welcome back to Speaking Freely. When we left off, we were talking about diversity within mainstream media, diversity of opinion, and why it's seemingly lost in many mainstream media outlets. Tara, I want to start with you. Maybe you can tell us about the CBC, and in your opinion, what happened to that diversity? Did it just get quashed by fear? What was the story there?
So I think with my former employer, the issue that I had was that the woke quote unquote woke worldview had become dominant in the institution. And that was a voice that had always been in the room, but it was increasingly the only voice in the room. And like Jamil, I care very deeply about diversity of thought. And I also think it's incredibly important to reflect the views across the country. And so my issue with the definition of diversity was that it was too narrow, that it was focused on superficial diversity as opposed to a rich and deep diversity. And so the way that I define that sort of rich and deep diversity is looking at all kinds of things like geography, like religious background, like educational background, like economic background, and also, of course, political and viewpoint diversity. And I felt that there was just a too narrow a range of views being represented, and that it was inhibiting our ability to really serve the public.
Excellent. Now, Jen, bringing you back to the place you were kind of leaving off, when you and Matt started The Line, was it an express goal to sort of stake out ground that many people talk about, but you just didn't see expressed in kind of mainstream newspapers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of institutional context under which we started The Line is probably worth discussing, because we were at a particular moment where, as Tara said, this kind of woke, and we'll use that term broadly, woke review was essentially taking over institutions. And I was seeing this from the outside and Matt was seeing this from the inside. But the only way that I can actually describe this is that it almost felt as if a cult were suddenly just taking over these places where we worked and had worked for.
Yeah.
And that, like I'm not even kidding. Like, that's literally what it felt for. All of a sudden it was like I could have an open conversation about anything with my editor, and we would brainstorm, we'd come up with stuff, to like 6 weeks later, nope, we're not publishing that. Can't touch it. And you know why. And I can't tell you why, but you know why. And it was very sudden. It was very swift. I do think that some of that's eased off since then. I do think that it's become a little bit more liberal in its approach, but for a couple of months there, things got really scarily liberal, and that I think is why in part why we decided to fly. It wasn't the only reason; there were other reasons as well. But yes, it was this explicit desire to kind of push back against a frightening and sudden sort of sense of a liberalism that we felt was sweeping through our institutions.
Right, and that's an irony, right? Because in the tradition, the progressive and liberal left has been open to ideas, and it's sort of been thought that that was the right that wanted to quash opinions and stamp out, debate and issues.
They
and
did,
ideas. Yeah.
and they still do.
Yeah.
That's the problem,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's true. Now, Jamil, you've been also very clear about this very point that we've just been talking about. How did you see it play out, and when did things shift for you? Because I know in your case, it wasn't necessarily a voluntary leave that happened, and your radio show was attracting listeners. Yeah, what happened there? Did you see a shift that happened around the same time?
Yeah, well, I got into the radio industry around the time that this change was occurring, where certain kind of hyper progressive views on race and gender and sexuality and frankly even class were starting to take shape in all of these institutions. But what I was lucky to have was a great boss.
Yeah.
For most of my time in the radio industry, I had a program director who was just fantastic to work for, because he believed, like I do, that our goal should not be to force everyone into fear if they deviate from the company line, but they actually want to encourage debate and discussion. So once he was fired, which happened a couple of months before I was fired, then it just, the walls came down and it became completely unsustainable. I felt like I was by myself. And the difference between me and a lot of the other folks who work in the industry is I'm not scared. I don't depend on this industry for my career. I have training in other fields. So I wasn't willing to be pushed around the way a lot of my colleagues unfortunately are. And I will definitely stress that I think a lot of people who work in the industry do believe it should be more diverse and more vibrant, but they're scared into silence.
Wow, that's powerful. One theme I want to pick up before the next break is this idea that I think you hinted at, Jamil, just there, which was this sort of, and Jen, you mentioned it, and Tara as well, is there a fear amongst large corporations now that they do not want to be accused of being anti-progressive and anti-liberal? and you've all used the word woke. Is there kind of a fear that you don't want to be on the other end of some criticism? And I think maybe we'll start with Tara, or end the segment with Tara. You worked at the CBC, which is a bastion of, I think, more left or liberal thinking, and you yourself called yourself a kind of more left and progressive reporter when you were there. Maybe just tell us quickly what you think on that issue.
Well, I think that it's really difficult to unpack, actually, because what is considered left is not really what most people would understand as left. I mean, what you're dealing with is a sort of movement and an ideology that is not anti-establishment. It is not pro-working class. It is not pro-free speech. It is not all the things that we've traditionally understood the left as. And as Jen mentioned, it is very illiberal. So I think there's a real confusion on what this actual ideology is, especially for the public. And I will say, I think what is clear, sort of reporting, is that it's very unpopular with the public. And so I think there's massive sort of changes happening within the inside. I do think there's a lot of pressure on newsrooms. So just briefly, I think a couple of those pressures are Twitter. It has an outsized influence. And the economic pressures. I mean, one of the problems at the CBC is that it employs precarious labor. And if you don't know what your shifts are past 2 weeks from now, you're not going to be fighting in the newsroom for different perspectives. And that's what you need. You need an argument. You need bias against bias to come to some sort of fair analysis and to include other viewpoints with which you do not agree.
Tara, that's a great way to end this segment. Picks up on what Jamil said about fear. And maybe the fear is driving a lot of this kind of new wokeism, if you want to call it, or this illiberal form of liberalism. So when we come back, I want to touch on that theme, but I also want to explore ways out of it. And I think you three offer, I think, a hope for Canadians in getting undistilled media information that's honest and also, I think, informative. So when we come back, we'll hear from all of you on that theme. Thank you. Welcome back to Speaking Freely. When we left off, we were talking about fear and whether fear is driving a lot of the self-censorship we're seeing in mainstream media outlets. Jen, I want to get your opinion. Is this happening on a daily basis? Are people really scared to voice opinions in newsrooms? And if so, why?
Yes. That's a really easy one to answer. I mean, people who criticize us on a lot of this cancel culture stuff will criticize us for pointing out that, well, you don't provide specific examples. Show me examples of stories that didn't appear. Provide me examples of self-censorship. And of course, it's almost impossible to prove a negative. All I can point to is that, like, I've had so many private conversations from editors in tears, from angry former employees, from fellow reporters who are just terribly frustrated and too afraid to speak out publicly. That's all I can tell you.
Yeah, wow. That reminds me of something, Tara, in kind of doing some research for the show. I saw a program that you had done with Jesse Brown, and he was hitting you hard on that issue. Give me examples, give me examples. Even though I think he's more or less on your side collectively. But do you have a similar sense that there is self-censorship, which is almost impossible to show?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of complications. That interview was a complicated one to do because I did not want to implicate any of my colleagues. And of course, we all work very collaboratively. And so it's very difficult to sort of talk about those things without bringing other people into the conversation. So I will say that. The other thing I'll say is that exactly as Jen said, that the self-censorship is incredibly high right now. And it's even high among people who share the woke worldview. And people are terrified, and I would say with good reason. I mean, the fact is that your livelihood is on the line. That is absolutely true. The other fact is that we don't exactly know where the line is. And I think that is very scary. And I can tell you from pushing almost on a daily basis for 2 years that you wouldn't know exactly where the line is. Like sometimes it would go through, sometimes it wouldn't, sometimes it would cause a problem, sometimes it wouldn't. And, Matt Taibbi talks about this a lot, that actual uncertainty about where the line is makes it so that most people will stay incredibly far away from it just to be safe.
Right. Oh, that's an excellent analogy. You stay away from the line so you don't fall over the cliff. I want to shift gears just slightly now and maybe go to Jamil. I think you probably would agree with those kind of sentiments, but is there a way forward? Can we get past the fear and talk freely again?
Yes, and I would say if anyone asks you for proof that cancel culture exists, you could tell them that I got fired. I'm proof that if you cross the line, they will fire you.
Wow.
It happens in real life.
Yeah.
And when it comes to how we fix that, though, which I think is a fantastic question, I think it's very important for people to realize that the journalists that they're seeing on Twitter or that they're hearing on the radio or watching on television do not have the power. They may be the face of media, but there are very highly paid executives at every big media company that are paid to police how we talk about certain things and make sure that everyone stays in line. And those folks are afraid of their bosses, who are corporate officers who sit on publicly traded companies. And those people who are corporate officers are afraid of investors. So there is a very big economy around this line that we're talking about. Everybody is afraid, all from the bottom of the corporate ladder all the way to the top. Everybody's trying to protect their jobs. And it's people who make the most money, investors like BlackRock, for example. Google them and you'll see they are the ones who make the most money, and they are frankly setting the rules of the game that everyone else is playing in.
Yeah, I think the CEO of BlackRock just the other day was quoted saying, sometimes you have to force behaviors on your employees, you know.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, these are unelected people who are incredibly powerful, influencing our democracy every single day.
Now, well said. Jen, can I just bring you in here? Do you think in terms of the future, there is hope in the sort of Substack or Medium world where people can gather a following? I know your journalistic outlet, The Line, is highly influential, and it's done so in a very short order of time. I know Jamil was a big fan of The Line. That's how he found out about me. Yeah. Jen, do you think there's that kind of hope that we have that independent media will fill this gap?
To some extent, although I would disagree with Jamil. And the funny thing in all of this is that I wouldn't presume that everyone on this panel is conservative or uber conservative. I think Tara and Jamil and I would if you got into the nitty gritty of any of this, we would have great fights about a lot of this stuff. The thing that we share is a fundamental agreement that those fights should be happening in a liberal framework, right? We shouldn't be shutting down people we disagree with, generally speaking. But I kind of disagree with him on one point, and that is the idea that this is all sort of being dictated from above. I think that what we're dealing with for the most part is a cultural shift that's actually happened very much from the grassroots up. I mean, the ostracization that problematic individuals now face, both in their careers and in social media and in their private lives, is very real. I mean, I know of people, for example, who have been like punitively DM'd by their peers for retweeting the wrong person. You know what I mean? Like it's also, there's a whole guilt by association thing that's totally taken over the culture as well, is that if you've published something by someone who has been deemed problematic or been ostracized, you're kind of guilty of their sins as well. So it really is in some ways a very classic sort of bottom up, top kind of witch hunt kind of scenario. And that makes it very pernicious and very, very hard to change, because you have to get people back on board with some basic liberal ideas and ideals from the ground up. And I think that fixing that is going to be really, really hard, because it does involve a cultural shift within these institutions. Now, can this be fixed? There's a couple of things that will and are happening. One is that, as Tara mentioned at the top of the show, the audience hates this ideology. This is such a minority elite ideology. Like, this is 3% of the population, overwhelmingly highly educated, people who live in a very small, very clustered in a small geographic area, who all socialize together, have extremely bought into this ideology. And a lot of people are going along with it in order to keep their jobs and keep their heads down. But like, this is not ordinary people. This isn't mainstream. This isn't like 80-90% of people don't buy into this stuff. And when they see, or they even sense that their outlets have been taken over by this, it's incredibly off-putting. And that's created this extraordinary financial opportunity for independent outlets to fill the gaps that people know they're missing. Right. So there's that.
I think we need to, bring it to a close there, but I think that does give us hope. Notwithstanding, I think you're right, this double push from the bottom and also from the top. It's kind of squeezing the broad base, which was the middle, who wanted to hear differences of opinion and weren't afraid to hear views that were different from each other, and were presented as long as they were presented in a kind of respectful way. I just want to thank you all for this discussion. I thought this was excellent. I think all of you brought your own perspectives, but also gave us a lot to think about. And I'm encouraged by the sort of last part of today's segment, which I think you're right. The independent voice is sort of emerging as a place where people can hear the things that they used to hear on mainstream outlets, but which they're increasingly not. So once again, thank you very much. Our guests were Tara Henley, Jamil Jivani, and Jen Gerson. You can follow them on their respective outlets on Substack. And after the break, we're going to hear more from the audience that's listening and hearing these people on the street. So thank you very much. Welcome back. We just heard from 3 independent journalists that have decided to go alone, talk about their views, and not rely on a corporate kind of machine to decide on what they can say or not say. I think there are 3 themes that emerged from that discussion, and I've kind of encapsulated them in 3 words: diversity, fear, and hope. Diversity. What do we really mean by diversity? Are we talking about superficial qualities, having the right proportion of women and persons of color, or do we mean something different in the context of media and journalism? Do we want to talk about diversity of opinions, diversity of approaches? It seems to me that the media panel that we just convened focused on the latter, that the superficial forms of diversity can actually be masking a real conformity of opinion. And maybe this is what's driving people to outlets like Substack, because the diversity that people want to see on a nightly basis is just missing. So diversity, I think, can go much deeper and much broader in current discussion. And it's one explanation why the media, I think, is splintering, and why news outlets like The Line or Substack journalism, like the kind that Jamil Jivani and Tara Henley have started, is attracting such a wide audience. Second idea, fear. So what's creating this conformity? It seems that the fear is being driven both from a top-down and a bottom-up. Let's start with the bottom. The social media universe is full of people who are always looking for the wrong word and the wrong quote. And there's a lot of self-censorship that can occur in mainstream media outlets. Why? Because if someone on Twitter decides to make you the focus of their rant and they have a large enough following, well, then your superiors start to know about it. And then your job is literally on the line. So we heard that fear might be what's driving a lot of this conformity. But that's just one source of fear from the Twitterverse. But there's a top-down form as well from corporate executives that also have the same fears of disrupting their nicely, publicly managed personas. Their brands matter. And these big, large media companies, the bigger they get, the harder they can fall. And so there's a twinning of this fear at the top of these organizations that pushes down on people like Jamil Jivani or Tara Henley or Jen Gerson. So what's the solution? And this is where hope comes in, our third theme. Hope is in the very technology that in some ways is performing some of the harder aspects of working in media today, the Twitterverse and the social and peer group mudslinging that can accompany someone who has a diverse opinion right now. But the hope is that people, armed with their own faculties and their own intelligence, can get out there and get the information they need. Platforms like Substack and Medium have given voice, literally, to journalists of high quality who have found that their views are being censored or self-censored as being part of these more corporate media machines. So the hope lies in places where people are finding their information increasingly. We heard about it on the streets of Toronto. A generational divide, I think, is occurring. People in younger demographics are finding the information that they want and need on their own. Sure, this might not come with the same gatekeepers that we used to find in traditional media, but if the gatekeepers are focusing on a kind of diversity that's superficial and are fearful of putting out opinions that they think will incite a backlash, well, really, what people are doing is just finding that information for themselves. They are the gatekeepers. And as you could tell from the 3 people we had on the panel today, there's really not a sort of worry that these people are acting in bad faith. I think each of them has a burning desire to tell Canadians the truth. And if Canadians can go out and find that truth now increasingly easier on the internet, then who's to say that that's a bad thing or a worrisome development? I think the liberal West is turning decidedly illiberal, and we need independent voices like the ones we had on air today to provide us with that diverse opinion that takes away the fear and gives us hope. Hope about the future and hope that we can make better decisions as informed citizens who get the information we need when we need it. Thank you for joining us today on Speaking Freely. We hope that today's show about the media, the rise of independent journalism, and what the hope for Canada's future media landscape looks like has given you something to think about. We look forward to seeing you again on Speaking Freely. Goodbye for now.